a few days before 25 de Abril, to be honest with you. And so I do have a close connection with the 25 de Abril, especially since my dad did fight in Angola from 1969 through 1972, I believe. And so my regular profession is a data center manager. So all the reason why I had an emergency and I had to leave, otherwise we wouldn't have Zoom. So in regards to the Portuguese community, I've been involved with the Portuguese community since I was about 11 or 12 years old. Been part of the bands, the churches, the folklores, Carnaval, and now within the last 10 years involved with Fado. And that to me, that's the biggest connection I have with 25 de Abril and the impact of pre-25 de Abril and Fado and what it did to Fado afterwards. So, and I'm also an honored ex-student of Mr. José Luís da Silva, which I'm so happy to be a part of this panel today. So. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you for all your work in the Portuguese American community in the Bay Area. Elaine, we'll jump over to Canada.
I'm Elaine Avila. I'm a playwright and a professor of creative writing, and I'm the author of this book called Fado, the saddest music in the world. And I do talk about Cinco de Abril in that book. I was born in Maryland and raised in San Jose, California, like David Garcia, and I now live in Vancouver, BC, like Esmeralda Cabral. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. This is truly a North American. This is our second North America panel. The first one was actually with the launching of your wonderful book, Fado, your play that I'm looking forward to getting it. It should be in my mailbox soon. And I want to then introduce to you and have him introduce himself, Sergio Ferreira.
Thank you, Denise, for the invitation and warm welcome to all my fellow panelists and guests. I'm Sergio Ferreira. I grew up in Peabody, if you're a local, Massachusetts. I was born in Salem. My parents were immigrants. My father's from Coimbra. I grew up in the Portuguese community, going to the festas, going to Clube Luís de Camões as a kid. Went to Boston College, and after graduation had a wonderful year of service where I worked at the Portuguese Continental Union under the auspices of Francisco Mendonça, which is a great year for me. And I sadly had left PCU and joined my current employer. I've been there for now at Mass Housing Finance Agency. I'm the chief underwriter, director of rental operations at Massachusetts Housing Finance Agency. I started there 25 de Abril, 1994. So it's a very important date for me. And I'm just thrilled to join the panelists today.
Thank you. And Sergio is in charge of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee for PALCUS, as you can see PALCUS there on his background. And Annabella, since we're talking about PALCUS.
Oh yes, thank you, and again, thank you for inviting me to this panel. I too am a director of PALCUS with Sergio. Sergio and I have a lot in common, actually. We share an alma mater. We both went to Boston College. I went to school mainly in New England. I was born in Portugal, lived in Africa and Portugal before coming to the United States in 1978. So it seems like a century ago, but I was in Portugal during the 25 de Abril. I don't think I was old enough to understand exactly what had happened at the time, but I knew what was going on. I am a lawyer. I live in New Jersey. I practice primarily in the Portuguese community. About 75-80% of my clients are Portuguese speaking. My practice is in Elizabeth. I have a very busy practice these days. Whether it's as a result of COVID or not, I don't know, but I practice primarily family law. And I am a municipal prosecutor. So on either side, COVID has kept us very, very busy.
Wow, interesting. And I thought you had come here. I knew you came very, very young. I thought you didn't even remember the 25 de Abril when you came over,
no.
but you already.
I came here. I was a sophomore in high school. So,
okay, so
yeah.
My bad, as my students would say,
okay.
because I thought you had come at like 2 or 3 years old. And from Annabella, we would go to Esmeralda.
Hi. Yes, I'm Esmeralda Cabral, and I was born in Ponta Delgada in São Miguel, but my family lived in Lagoa. And we emigrated. Maybe you were thinking of me, Denise, because I came when I was 7. We came to Canada, to Edmonton, of all places. And I now live in Vancouver. And I've worn many hats, but I'm currently writing full time. So I write creative nonfiction. And yes, so when we came in '69, my older sister was in university in Lisbon. And I think in those days, it was hard to be a university student under the dictatorship. And my parents actually came to Canada because they didn't want the other 2 daughters to go that same road. So basically, they came for my education.
Wonderful. And you're a wonderful writer. Thank you for continuing to have Portuguese themes. We appreciate that. And we talk about creativity. We'll go to another creator, Zé Duarte.
Thank you, Denise, for the invitation. And nice to meet some of you and know a few of you on this panel. I was born in Pico, in the Azores Islands, and was born and raised. And I immigrated to the United States in 1984. So I got some of the before 25 de Abril and some of the after 25 de Abril until I immigrated to the United States. I am a musician. I work for San Diego City Schools, but I'm a musician with more than 30 original recordings, and most of them in Portuguese. And that's about it. I really live in San Diego, on the community that I really like. It's not just the weather. The weather, as you probably know, it's a wonderful weather all the way around. You don't see me from the waist down, but I'm in shorts right now, by the way. And so the weather
we don't want to see it's okay. So.
Yeah. You never know. I might say I'm in shorts and I'm not.
That's right. That's right. So Ben Quintuage, it's better you don't show us. Yes.
Yeah, that's what yeah, better. The San Diego community, it's actually a really great mix of most people from Pico, the fishermen, and the Madeira, and a small percentage of Fuzeta from the south of Portugal. So it's a nice mixture. Makes it the event really. I say they are really happy, special on singings and parties and drinking too. So it's a really exciting community, even knowing that I know most of the community is not just California, but the East Coast and some of the Canada. And again, thanks. And it's nice to be part of this panel to talk about 25 de Abril. Nice to meet some of you too.
Thank you, Zé. And we'll go over to Inish Eilish.
Hello, nice to meet everyone. Thank you, Denise, for inviting me to be on the panel and to meet everyone. I was born in Madeira Island. I came when I was 7 years old, and I immigrated in the 70s. And my experience with the 25 de Abril is I was attending Escola Portuguesa do Clube Madeirense de Hayward and doing the quarta class, and they canceled our exams because of the revolution. But the teacher said, don't worry, you pass. In my book, you pass. So I passed the quarta class. I went on to continue with my Portuguese studies at Cal State University, Hayward. And I studied with Dr. Don Warren, if anyone knows him. In my Portuguese community, I was a co-director of a folklore group in my teens and in my college years, and also participated in some theater groups in San Leandro with Lucian Cardoso and acted in those plays, had a lot of fun with all the people. I have a passion for Portuguese culture, and therefore I liked to give that back by hosting and adminning a page that promotes events and culture. So I do that on Facebook, and I've done that for 9 or 10 years now. I also have been a co-director of the Marcha São João at BGM in Hayward with my partner Cecilia Eich for the last 8-9 years there. And we had a 2-year break with COVID, so everyone's missing that fun. I'm a real estate agent by profession, and that's how I make a living. And it's fun to be here, and I'm happy to say that 2 years ago, as one of the committee members of the Hayward Fado Sister City committee, we actually hosted our first event because the committee had been dormant for a few years, and our first event was 25 de Abril. And we had a 25 de Abril theme, so we sang Grandola, and we had performers that sang all the Zeca Afonso songs, and it was quite nice to celebrate it. So we do celebrate the 25 de Abril.
Wonderful. And from Inês, thank you so much. My good friend José Luís, my camarada.
Hey, hello everybody, my name is José Luís da Silva. Like Esmeralda, I was born in São Miguel, in Ponta Delgada, and I immigrated in 1969 to the United States. So a couple of things in common there. I live in Fremont, very close to San Jose. I taught most of my teaching career was in San Jose High School, High Academy, depending on the term. I taught Portuguese mostly. I also taught French and Spanish, and we had an international baccalaureate program there, and that's where David Garcia was my most distinguished student. So I'm very proud of students like him, but he's one of those that's right on the top because he was president of the Portuguese club, and it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun working with students like David and others. So that's about it. And I'm very thankful to be in this panel. It's always an honor to be communicating with other people through this media that brings us together in this time of separation and pandemics, which hopefully are coming to an end.
Let's hope so, indeed. Indeed. Thank you, José Luís. And Miguel Avila.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with all of you. Miguel Avila. I was born in Angra do Heroísmo and was 5 years old when the revolution happened. My parents and my brother were actually in Lisbon at the time, so they witnessed the revolution firsthand. My sister and I were at our grandparents' house in Terceira. So remember vividly how my grandfather used to listen to BBC and other stations that were not approved by the government before April 25th, 1974. And how we had to have the doors closed and the windows shut while he was listening to to those radio stations on shortwave radio. And then I remember vividly all the speeches that happened right after the revolution. That I remember vividly. And then 1983, we came to the US. It was a great opportunity. We actually, quick story. We were sitting down. This was right after the 1980 earthquake in the Azores. And my parents asked, there's 5 of us, the 2 parents and the 3 kids. We have 2 options. We're going to move to Lisbon or we're moving to the US. And the vote was 3-2 in favor of the US. So very democratic. I was 12 at the time, and my brother and sister are younger. And so we all got to vote. That was democracy at its best, and I lost. I actually lost. I voted to go to Lisbon. So came here, finished high school here in the San Francisco Bay Area, went to San Jose State University, and one of the first events that I remember organizing at San Jose State was a celebration of 25 de Abril. Not very well received, to be honest with you, amongst the Portuguese community at the time. And but again, we wanted to celebrate mostly not just about the revolution, but what it meant, right? The values of the revolution, the values of freedom and democracy. So again, glad to be here. I'm also professionally, I'm an executive in a medical device company, and my spare time, I'm the editor-in-chief of the Portuguese Tribune.
Thank you, Miguel. And so we'll start our rounds, and we'll just might follow the same pattern, just a little bit different. And my first question was basically, what are your thoughts about the revolution? I mean, we have various generations, various experiences. Some of you experienced it at a very young age in Portugal. Others were a little bit older. Others experienced it already here. The majority were already here. Some of you, as David, his parents immigrated, around the revolution time. So I wanted to basically ask, and some of you touched up very briefly on it with your intros, but what are your thoughts? What are your experiences and your thoughts about the revolution in Portugal? What does it signify to you? What does it mean to you? The 25 de Abril and the Carnation Revolution. And we'll start with David.
Thank you, Dinesh. So oddly enough, in our house, we never really spoke about 25 de Abril. The topic was mainly about my dad's experience in the army and fighting in Angola and the losses of the provinces or the colonies during that war. It wasn't so much the revolution itself of 25 de Abril. Up until high school, 25 de Abril, it's when Salazar was brought down, that's all I really heard much about it. And it wasn't until going into high school and going into Mr. De Silva's Portuguese class, and I'm not saying this to da graça, but that's essentially where I learned the true meaning of, what 25 de Abril was all about. And then later on, once I started singing about fado and just realizing even simple poems being prohibited to be sung in Portugal is ridiculous to me. And I say this because I live in a very democratic country right now. Scary enough, borderlining going back to some dictatorships if there wasn't some changes a couple of months ago. But again, we never really spoke about 25 de Abril. And even today in the communities, sadly to say, I still hear a couple of people say, oh, Portugal needs another Salazar, rah, 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 and they're hooting their horns. And I don't understand where that mentality is coming from and why they're saying it, which is another reason why I think we probably don't see as many celebrations of 25 de Abril as we probably should see in our community.
Some good thoughts indeed. Indeed, it's not something that you hear on an everyday. Inês mentioned a couple of years ago, right before we went into the pandemic, that it was celebrated, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. It's been done a lot in the academic world and in schools, but has not been really involved in and sometimes in a sister city relationship, like Inês mentioned. Tulare Younger Sister City Foundation has had one or two, but it's one of the events that it wasn't widely participated, I can tell you.
Right, and I think José Luis, along with Yulinda Adão in Berkeley, did, the last thing I remember was in 2014, and I was a part of it for the 40th anniversary of 25 de Abril, where we did commemorate and had some festivities, and Zeca Afonso, I sang a couple of songs of his, but further than that, you don't really see a huge celebration about it.
It's been mainly academic, that's true. Elaine, your thoughts on the 25 de Abril? It is your play touches upon it in various ways, and so talk to us a little bit about it.
Well, my grandfather immigrated from Pico in the 1920s, and my grandmother joined him in the 1930s. And so it was more important for my father and my aunt to assimilate into American culture. So I grew up completely outside of Portuguese culture, and we didn't know anything about Portuguese literature, even though some of my family became literature professors of French literature. They didn't know anything about Portuguese literature. And so I began to wonder, why is there so much pressure for immigrants to assimilate and become American and not know very much about their past? Like, to me, that meant there was a lot of power there. So in 2012, I had a residency to write Portuguese plays here in Vancouver. And that was when I began learning about the history and literature and improving my Portuguese. And I think it's one of the most powerful stories out there. It's an amazing that the longest dictatorship of modern times was brought down mostly peacefully. And given what was just happening in the last American presidency, these forces are very very omnipresent, and for us to really understand like what's happening in Brazil now, that's also suffering from a dictatorship, to understand how the military is involved, how the people are involved, how voting is involved. To me, it's just a beautiful and powerful story about connecting to poetry, about connecting to music, and connecting to our heritage. So
it's a very good point, and we'll talk about. We'll explore that a little bit more. How we can connect through the 25 de Abril. That's a very good point. Sergio, your thoughts on 25 de Abril?
Sure, Denise. So I was like Miguel. I was 6 years old during the 25 de Abril, and I was here in the States in Massachusetts. I remember my parents being very concerned because we had family in Coimbra, an uncle in Lisbon. So immediately I remember the family, just as a kid, all the adults were very concerned about the safety and well-being of people there. And then that gave way over the months that led after that. And the little that I could pick up as a child, reflecting back on it, was concern about some of the political machinations and rise of the communist tide within Portugal that lasted a couple of years, I remember. And we as a family took our first Portuguese trip, all three brothers, my two younger brothers, our family, for the first time to meet our grandparents, if you could believe it, in 1976, the summer of 76. And I remember there was still a concern about communism and the rise of concern that the Soviets were getting a toehold in Europe through Portugal, reflecting back on it. So what does it mean to me as an adult, though, as looking back on it? From what I've read and from what I've thought about it, there are a few things that come to mind that I'd share with you. The first, it feels like this was the beginning of the end. This really was the end of the Portuguese colonies and, frankly, European colonies in Africa. This is the beginning of the end of all that for over 5.5 centuries. Number one, so that colonial era kind of ended then. The second thing that I think about is this set in from what I understand, it really set in motion a third wave of democratization throughout Europe. In fact, ironically, people were worried about the communists. It turns out this was actually, to as everyone's talking about, you remember the democracy. You remember the rise of democracy in a bloodless coup. And it gave rise to the decline of communism in Europe and ultimately the Soviet Union. Frankly, we don't get enough credit for that because this is where it began. Because the buildup and the justification for this military buildup that began in the 70s and into the 80s really manifested itself coming out of the concern out of what happened in Portugal. So this is a major pivotal political moment that had repercussions to today, and I feel it should be celebrated. We should celebrate this on par with Dia de Portugal because this is something that made a lasting impact to all of us and our future generations.
Thank you, Sergio. Yes, some very good thoughts. And to add to your thoughts before we go over to Annabella of course, Annabella has the experience of living in Africa at a very young age, but of living in a colony. One of the gentlemen that was part of the event that PBBI put forth on the 20th here about a few days ago, one of the commanders of the revolution, basically now Admiral Martins Guerreiro, said that one of the reasons, of course, he said some things went well, some things did not. That happens in revolutions, that happens in everyday life when we go to work. And one of the things, of course, that he felt didn't go as well was the decolonization that you mentioned. But one of the reasons was, of course, because we had been in a war for 15, 16 years. And so it was just when everybody else had done decolonization, we came at it really late and really with a lot of bad blood being spilled, on both sides of the field. But anyway, Annabella, your thoughts on the 25 de Abril?
Oh, I lived in Africa for a very brief time in one of the colonies. I lived in Mozambique. In fact, my sister was born there. We have a joke in the family. The kids, when they were little, used to say, Titi was born in Africa. How come she's not Black? Little things like that come to mind because she was born there. But we actually lived mostly right next door to Mozambique in a little country called Swaziland. Mm-hmm. There was a big connection to Mozambique, and being right next door, often trips were to Mozambique. But leaving there shortly before the 25 de Abril, and returning to Portugal, where I was when 25 de Abril happened, being 12 at the time, I do remember a lot. And one of the, the big thing was like the political influx, the comícios. It was, the big thing. They would go from town to town, and everybody wanted to be heard. But the most important thing I remember was the voting. People had the right to vote. And here you have a country of a lot of people were illiterate. They could not read or write. And in a small town, it was so important that people knew who to vote for. And they would go to the poll, and the ballot would have like 20 or 30 parties on it at the time, because they're coming out of the woodwork, people like, Álvaro Cunhal and Mário Soares and all those other, people that came from town to town trying to convince people. And that I think were the names that stick to your mind because of communism. And you still hear the older folks saying, oh, eram os comunistas, but the voting was so important that I remember the older folks who couldn't read or write and being taught how to recognize the party that they were going to vote for. And just like today we have emojis, every party would have their little symbol, but the symbols were confusing. And I remember the older folks coming back, oh, who'd you vote for? Oh, I voted for the best. Era o mais trabalhador, tinha a foice e o martelo, and they had no idea what it was. And it was not their intention to vote for any kind of, left party, but the bottom line was they didn't know any better. So, I mean, as a kid, I remember things like that. So it was pretty interesting.
Indeed. That's a wonderful memory to have of, because that was important to a lot of people. I recall that one of my aunts, she was already one of my eldest aunts. It was her biggest thing about the revolution was that she got to go vote in 1975. I mean, that to her was just
big.
And she got to go vote not just for one person, because that's what you voted before, when they had, mock-up elections. Right. She voted for, she says there were like, 28 people to choose from. And that was, to her, was a big thing. She was in her 60s at the time. And that was really something so it's wonderful to share that. Thank you. Esmeralda, your thoughts about and your experiences with the 25 de Abril.
Yeah, well, I was pretty young. I mean, I was 12. I do remember going to Lisbon in 1972 to visit my sister, and there were bombs going off no quartel, and she didn't show up at home one time because she was caught in a student protest, and my parents became very concerned about her, and so she actually joined us in Canada in 1973, so just before the revolution. So when 74 happened, when the revolution happened, I remember relief that, she was with us. But interestingly, I also remember some fear, like my parents were afraid of the uncertainty and what did that mean? Could we go back, and what was going to happen to their house and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, now I wish I could ask them. Of course, they died quite a long time ago, and I don't ask, but I can't ask. But I do remember when they were voting in Canada, that here people put signs on their lawns who they're going to vote for, and they would always say no, because they were always afraid, and they didn't want anybody to know that they were going to be voting for this person or that person. So there were some leftover, residual signs of that oppression. But that's all that, that I remember from that time. I was in Lisbon for I was living in Lisbon for the 40th anniversary in 2014. And that was amazing. I learned a lot then about the revolution and the history, and but from 74, I don't remember a whole lot.
Okay. And in 40 years later, I mean, not 40 years later, but the 40th anniversary, yes, 40 years later. So when you were there, did you feel, just very quickly, did you feel that folks were in tune to the commemoration, or was it just a holiday to go to the beach? What were your
Oh
thoughts?
no. So in Lisbon at that time, the whole month of April, there were photography exhibits all around the city, and there were book fairs and books on sale and music, and it was pretty big. And then the 25th of April, there were huge not a demonstration, but marches down the Avenida da Liberdade with all the unions, and it was actually quite something.
Thank you for sharing that. And Zé Duarte, 25 de Abril, how was it?
How was it? My story about the 25 de Abril, it was the beginning of high school for me. And I still remember vividly that we were in a class and there was so much talk, but I couldn't understand exactly what people and teachers were talking about. Because we were so used to dictatorship, the government controlled everything. And I still remember certain things that are still pathetic on these days, like you'd have to have a license to have a cigarette lighter, to light a cigarette in Portugal. Things like that, that the PID, and some of you might remember the name, the PID would control in Portugal privately. So it was such a big difference. So the change when I said before and after. So that day of school, sure, we didn't have school the rest of the day. So that was more important for me than probably what they were talking on the radio. And I did not understand at the time exactly what was going on. One of the things that I still remember, and at the time I was really enjoying the music as a teenager and being involved on a band of young players that was well known at the island, Os Minilheiros. And I still remember, and I cannot forget, that they had a secret to put a couple songs on the radio. And the first song that had to be on the radio to give a clue for the people that were involved on this 25 de Abril, I'll never forget, because I liked at the time the songs from Paulo de Carvalho. It was E Depois do Adeus, E Depois do Adeus. So I'll never forget that moment, because I didn't know what that meant at the time. Later on, we learned, okay, great. And so it was that one. And then after, as you all know, Grândola Vila Morena from Zeca Afonso. But Paulo Carvalho had some great fados that probably David also relates to that. Part of the influence for me about 25 de Abril is that I had some friends that were older that were going to Angola, Guinea. I have a cousin who went to Guinea, Mozambique, for the colonies. And I was scared of that, but then they started, they retreat, the troops from those colonies start coming back and not going, because I was next in line to go to the military. And in Portugal, I don't know if you knew at the time, everybody had to go to the military. So I did not escape. I went to the military, but I stayed, I was lucky enough to stay in the Azores because everybody was coming back from the colonies, and they were, as you know, 1975, some of them start getting, most of them, independent, and I was lucky enough not to be involved on any kind of war on the colonies. But I still have to finish my military service, which was at the time was already reduced. Instead of the 3 years that my older friends went to the colonies, I spent only a year and a half. And sure, we were prepared physically and all the guns and all that stuff, but we never had to really use it. And I was happy about that in that regards. Then I really emigrated later on, but between that, really, so the before, it's one thing where everybody's scared, the occasion of the 25 de Abril, which we learn a lot more after that, and I'm still young. And then after, as we learn more and more about the 25 de Abril and then the democracy, and yes, I registered to vote. I was so excited when I was old enough to register to vote in Portugal. So there's a lot of excitement after. And so I immigrate. I went to, right before I came to the United States, I still was studying biology in high school. So then I immigrated. I actually went to visit. I was supposed just to come and visit, but then I stayed. Really liked San Diego. One of the things that I thought, and I'm going to touch a little bit of David. David was questioning, he doesn't understand why people here did not celebrate too much 25 de Abril. And me coming from there, I felt the same thing because we celebrate a lot. Oh, it was Dia de Cornos, we did celebration, you name it. We did everything upside down. Another excuse to eat and drink, as you know, but it was a lot of party going on and exciting. But here in the United States, you got to realize that most of the immigrants came before the 25 de Abril. And they were used to that kind of regime, so they never felt the democracy as some of us did. So it was totally different. They never felt kind of the freedom that we had, because at a certain point, I actually thought we had too much freedom. And I think that's one of the things they still close themselves a lot, even knowing that certain times we have celebrated 25 de Abril in San Diego. You still have some of the old folks that really, that doesn't mean a lot to them. And I do understand why. In that regards, because they really never felt the democracy in Portugal. And as in Portugal, we develop in certain other ways. I still have family members that dizem a benção tio, they say in front, when they pass in front of a church. I never went through that in Portugal as I was growing up, because you came to the democracy and everything changed. It was not that connection anymore. Sure, the religion, we had freedom of religion after the 25 de Abril, which was a lot better too. Everybody had the right to have the freedom of religion, but it was so much different. So I had a little bit before, a little bit after, and then the part of the immigration. So it is good that Portugal went on that direction, especially knowing that was one of the last Western European countries to get the independence from that dictatorship of regime that we had back there. So it was very exciting, especially for us teenagers. I glue a lot of flag. I didn't even know which party I belonged to. I glued for Partido Socialista, I glued for Social Democrat. We just wanted to have out and be free. That was called out. You have the freedom to do that stuff. So I tell you the truth, that until today, I still don't have a party in Portugal that I like. I just enjoyed glued the flyers. And that was it was fun time for us teenagers. It was a good way for us to really see the before and after, because my father, at one point, he was vice president of the Câmara. So doesn't matter if you now believe on the freedom, you're still attached to the old regime a little bit. And people didn't see it the same way sometimes, even though that he believed on the revolution and on the democracy right after that too. But that's a little bit of my touch about 25 de Abril that I felt and went through personally.
Well, yeah, you had wonderful experiences being in high school at the time, where ideas it changed, abruptly. So that was really a wonderful experience to live. Of course, the ultimate 25 de Abril. I was in high school, but I was here. It was a little bit different situation, but it was eye-opening for me as well, because people began to ask me questions about Portugal. Up until the revolution, I recall I was watching Walter Cronkite, as some of you might remember, CBS News. We watch it every single evening at 6:00, and it was just amazing when I saw, what was going on in Portugal. And the next day, some of my friends who had never asked me about Portugal, they could care less about Portugal, and asked me, "Hey, what happened in your country? What's going on?" And I felt, to be honest with you, I was going through changes, as all of us do during the teenage years, and I wanted to be less Portuguese. I just, let that Portuguese part just stay at home with my parents. I want to be, I want to be American here, and the 25 de Abril to me was very important, because it brought me back into the culture that I was kind of letting go when I was 15 years old, almost 16. It brought me back because it brought Portugal into the forefront. People started talking about Portugal, and not that it still doesn't happen, but we still have people ask you if Portugal is the province of Spain. And of course that always irks all of us. But at that time, high schoolers didn't care, and still even less today probably, about the different parts of the world, but that they were asking me about my country, and they looked at my country different. Because up until then, the way they looked at my country was the Portuguese milkers of cows in Tulare and Kings County. That's what represented the Azores. That's what represented Portugal. All of a sudden, they see a country with that is going through a unique revolution, unique process. So it was unique here. But anyway, let's move on to Inês. Inês, your thoughts, of course, about the 25 de Abril and all of the different issues that we've been talking.
Well, I was quite young in the United States, but I do remember that my family, my parents, having been here a few years, they wanted to go visit their family, and they chose to go in December of 1975. So we go to Lisbon. My godfather, who's a professor, lived there, and my parents and I wanted to go visit him. So we are in Bairro Alto, and the first thing that we notice is the whole city is just plastered with, cartazes all over the place, posters and, parties. And it was just really a mess. And I thought, this city was so beautiful just a few years ago that we had stopped over before making our trip to America. And I was just like beside myself on how it looked. And we talked about, what was happening. My godfather was sharing stories. My parents never really talked about government to us kids. Growing up in Madeira, it was very isolated there. And later on, my father shared with me that he didn't feel safe talking about anything. So they just wouldn't. Because if you even go to the grocery store, you didn't know if there was a spy that was there. So you just didn't talk about any part of government. And I believe that the immigrants, the older people that Zedwar talks about, they came to America before the revolution, and they just kind of kept that peacefulness inside of them. They didn't have this spirit of rebellion, if you will. And I feel sometimes our people don't fight enough for their rights, because that came embedded from that period of time. And it makes me understand that. And another experience, as a teenager, early 20s, Lucian Cardozo put on a play in San Leandro, California. I think it was called, the playwright was Tragedia dos Montenegros. And I remember having a part in that play where it was the revolution. O povo unido jamais será vencido, and everybody was in chaos. And I thought, that's interesting that I get to relive this in a different format, in a theatrical way. But it was apparent that it was very much needed, and that I noticed when going back to Portugal how my family's lives had improved, and just so many differences in their lifestyle. And obviously they were ecstatic that they could vote. And my father always said, he's no longer with us, that he had wished that he had lived to vote in Portugal, and he never got to do that. But coming to America, to democracy, was wonderful. They've loved living in the United States because of the democracy that they didn't get to experience in Portugal.
Indeed, it's a wonderful story, and it reminds me of my dad as well. He has passed on as well, but one of the few things when he became a U.S. citizen was to vote here, because he voted there for one election because he was a public official. I mean, it worked for the public sector, so he had to vote for Salazar, whether he liked it or not. And he liked the idea of having options to vote for, instead of a candidato único. And so Miguel and José Luis are the next. And Miguel, I'll go to you, and then José Luis, and your thoughts, of course, on it, as well as on the revolution and how it, shaped, your thoughts on Portugal democracy itself, and here. And when you mentioned listening to the BBC, I believe it was you, in your grandfather's home. My dad actually went to jail for that. My dad went to jail for listening to the BBC. I mean, he was ruffled up a little bit, they let him out, but my mom cried all night long, and it was just a big deal. I was like, I think I was around six. And he would listen to it, and I didn't know what he was listening to. Okay, I knew he was listening to something. I mean, I was 6 years old, and I knew he was supposed to listen to it because my grandmother lived with us, and she got ticked off at him because he was listening to this. And he would always listen in the kitchen next to the oven, the where you bake the bread, the stone oven. He would listen in there, and he would always ask his mother if she had been cooking, because he didn't want to put the radio in there because it was warm. He didn't want the radio to bake, but that's where he listened and all lights off and everything else. But somehow a neighbor told on him, and that he must have had an argument with him. My dad was good at arguments, and he went and he was ruffled up and he was let go, and we had to give up the radio, which ticked me off, because I used to, not that I listened to the BBC, I like to listen to the Rádio Clube Dunga and the music, and so it was upsetting, but we lost our radio. So Miguel.
So one of the things that I remember vividly, so obviously being the older of three kids and not being the center of this revolution kind of ticked me off as a 5 going on 6-year-old. So when my brother got back from Lisbon, he had sets of notebooks with, he's a designer nowadays. And so he drew scenes from the 25 de Abril, from what he saw, the soldiers on the street, the tanks, etc. And somebody mentioned about, stickers and posters and so forth. So he brought this collection of, and the other thing that was amazing during that period is the cartoons that were drawn. I mean, there's cartoonists that came out of the woodwork with, brilliant stuff about satire mostly, right? So I remember that period, 74 to 76, mostly around, there's this, everybody wants to be involved. And again, like me, I mean, I remember with my brother, one time I was, there was the famous debate between Álvaro Cunhal and Mário Soares, and I remember my brother and I played that out, acted that debate out as little children. So the other scene that, fast forward a few years, we're packing up to come to the US. My dad has a very large collection of books. And he's like, we're not going without the books. So we're packing up, and obviously came in a different container and stuff, got here, I don't know, almost a year later. But as he's packing up the books, he turns to me and says something very, very interesting that I'm like, we're coming to a democratic country, freedom of expression, all thoughts are welcome. And he said, well, some of these books may not be well thought out when we get to the US. And so that took me, because my dad reads everything. And so there was a wide range of topics, there was a wide range of authors, and he made that comment. I'm like, what are we getting into? And then obviously coming here in 1983, the Reagan years, very anti-Soviet sentiment and all that. But that scene really marked me. I remember the actual scene of we're packing up the books, and he made that statement. So one of the lessons learned from me is you can't take anything for granted. And we saw that even more recently here in the US, right? So we can't take democracy for granted. We need to act when we're called upon in terms of voting, whether it's peaceful demonstrations and so forth. And that's one of the things that, as I grew up and went to, especially to college, and with that influence and that first event we did in celebrating the 25 de Abril, I had one parent say thank you. All the other parents of all the other Portuguese kids who were involved, they were looking the other way. Again, a lot of you mentioned, many of them came before the revolution. And again, I think what we should do, right, is to, again, look at the values that led to the revolution. There were mistakes made. There were things that were well done, but there were definitely mistakes made. And so not everything is perfect, but I think the values are still something to be celebrated.
Indeed, indeed. And that is exactly, Miguel, what the Admiral Martins Guerreiro said, to look at the program of the MFA and to look at the values, what they wanted to institute for the country. which was, having things that Portugal, he told this wonderful story before I passed it to José Luis, of when he went to, he had relatives that immigrated to France. And those of you who are from mainland Portugal can identify a little bit more with that there's a stronger immigration to France, where we from the Azores don't really, or Madeira don't immigrate much to France, a little bit, a few of them. But, and he said that, and José Luis will help me out for the retirement word for to retire in French. José Luis, he said something like retraite or something like that. Does it sound like that?
Retraite.
Yeah, and he said, of course, retraite in Portuguese is something else, but and he said that, he would ask these people, why don't you guys come back now that we have, the democracies, this is right after. And they would say, well, here we have a retraite, and in the beginning, of course, there's a retraite in Portugal as well. There's actually several of them. But, the idea that I never thought, because I actually was telling this to a student yesterday, when we came to this country, we had to go see this gentleman called João Ranchão, from the word ranch. And he had a big ranch, so it was called João Ranchão. He was a cousin of ours. And he was my grandfather's partner when my grandfather lived in the United States for 18 years. And so my dad was saying to my uncle, I need you to take me to see João Ranchão as soon as possible. I hate to bother you because, I'm going to start working hopefully in the next few days. And of course, him as well, we may not have time to see him, and I have, a gift for him and everything else. We always had to bring a gift. Everybody that immigrated from our family had to bring a gift to João Ranchão. And my uncle said this, and I recall this. I was 10 years old. I was standing there with my father. I would always go with my father everywhere. And he turned to my dad and he says, "Oh, not preocupe. Don't worry about João Ranchão. He's retire." And I said, "What the hell? Retire? He's retire. He's retire." And when Admiral, we all know what that is, of course, but when the Admiral said that, the concept of retirement was something that those early immigrants got in France. And that's why they never used the Portuguese word. And the concept of retire here was the same thing here, retire. Because my grandfather died in 1967 at 77 years old. He never retired. There was no retirement. So Portugal and the democracy did not have a retirement system, didn't have an education system past the 4th grade that was, mandatory to everybody. Didn't have, of course, the healthcare system, et cetera, et cetera. José Luis, your thoughts about the 25 de Abril, one of the fondest memories, of course, as your brilliant student mentioned. David Garcia was some of the events that we did together, Tulare and Tulare, Hanford a couple of times, and San Jose with our students to celebrate 25 de Abril. That was kind of a tradition that we did for many years.
Yes, that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it very much. When going back to the day of the revolution, I was an idealistic 22-year-old college student at Cal State Hayward, and I'd spent my childhood and my adolescence in Portugal, so I had lived through what it was prior to 25 de Abril. So there's a couple words. It's interesting because as Miguel was talking, just before that, I wrote down a word here, values, and then 30 seconds later, Miguel says values. So I'm in the right track. There's a couple of words that stick in my mind relating to the revolution. And one of them is freedom. The other one is opportunity. Let me elaborate on that. As I was touching here a little bit, for our community, freedom, liberdade, is almost a symbol of anarchy. I mean, it's a synonym of anarchy. You do whatever you want. And they don't realize the intrinsic value of freedom. I think only those who have not lived with freedom understand it. And the fear that we felt, your story about your father, at least about the radio, brings me back to a story when I was about 15 years old. The fear we felt was sometimes self-induced also. I remember that there was this urban legend, so to speak, that there was a van in São Miguel, and I guess all over Portugal, that had a special antenna that could detect what radio station you were listening to. So I remember at 15 going to bed, putting the covers on myself and closing the window and listening to the station from Argelia. That one that nobody was supposed to listen. One of Manolo Lag and others would go over there and speak about things, of course, very leftist. But I was not a leftist. I don't think I'm I'm a central left a little bit right now. I was never that, but the freedom to be able to do something that you were not supposed to do, that was very important. Remember that, talking about freedom, there were many books we could not read. Movies, in order to be shown in the movie theaters, had to be approved, and sometimes cut. Some parts of it. The censorship was very strong. So we lived through that fear. So when I was 22 years old in California and I heard about the revolution, I jumped with joy as a reaction to those years that we lived, mainly in the cities. I think in the countryside there was less of an awareness, and maybe that's the reason why our community is not that in touch with what happened in April 25th, because living in the countryside, you were very detached from the secret police most of the time. You detached from some of these things. So freedom is definitely a value, and I'd like to jump a little bit ahead of what we're going to be talking. As we look to celebrations of 25 de Abril, I think we make a mistake as we celebrate in this community, because for most Portuguese Americans, the symbols of the revolution mean nothing to them. The Carnation, the Grande Levida Morena, it's fun to do it. We did it in school, and it was interesting as an historical perspective. But if we want the 25 de Abril to have a real effect in the hearts of our community, I think we have to talk about what Miguel talked about, the values of revolution. So the values of freedom, the ability to the ability to vote, the ability to read the book you want, to talk to the people that you want, because you mentioned it, the secret police, the informants, that we never knew. And that, again, was our own fears. We never knew who was going to be the informant. So everywhere we went, like a cafe, we just assumed that there might be somebody there who would turn us in. So that says that feeling of freedom to be able to do what you want to do without this, without doing crazy things, but doing things that make your life meaningful. That is an essential value of the revolution, and we have to celebrate that. And I think our kids here in America that take freedom for granted, they need to understand what it is to live without freedom. And if they understand that, they'll understand the meaning of 25 de Abril. Zé Duarte has talked about the war in Africa. David also mentioned that. That was a fear that I lived my whole adolescence. I was getting ready to go to war. I didn't want to, but as a teenager, we knew we were going to have to do that. To go to a war, we could care less, and we might die over there and might have to kill people that we didn't even know. So the freedom from being forced to do things against your will, against your conscience, that's another value of the revolution. Finally, opportunity. That's something that we have to talk about. People immigrated here mostly, not because it was an adventure, not because this or that, but it's because they did not have the opportunities in Portugal. Salazar's regime, I'm sure he had some good things. I don't believe in anything being absolutely good, absolutely evil. And they did have some good things, I assume. But one of the things that it took away from a whole bunch of people was opportunities. People that were poor, they were born poor, they died poor. Very few people were able to exit from the socioeconomic class. Unfortunately, in Portugal today, still family, it still has a lot of power in where you get, how you get ahead in society. But that's much less than before. The middle class did reasonably well in Portugal. The poor people, the people in the farms, they paid the brunt of the price of what was going on in Portugal. So our immigrants come mostly from the countryside and from the agricultural community, and they did not have much opportunity. I still remember seeing many people going to work in the fields without shoes. I don't know if it was like that in Terceira. That was like that in San Miguel, and other islands. So what people now in Portugal have is, and by the way, I don't think people in Portugal appreciate that anymore. I don't think young people are aware of that. The freedom to live a life with openness, and the second one, the opportunities. You may be born in the countryside from a poor family, but you know, you will be able to go to university if you work hard enough and all that. The values that we have here in America, if you work hard enough, you'll be able to succeed. You couldn't do that in Portugal before the revolution. Very few people could do that. That's why many people, you know, found ways. They wanted to study, they wanted to learn, they had to go to the seminary to say that. Many of these people didn't have any vocation to be priests, and many of them abandoned it before they became priests, because that was the only possibility they could educate themselves. So education is paramount as we think about the values of the revolution. It allowed Portuguese young people to get educated and to get ahead and to live a life of that choice without fear.
Thank you, Luis. And indeed, I think that the values of the revolution and when the Admiral talked about the program of the MFA, I think it's something that we need to explore. And I've read it, but it's been a few years ago, and translated even, because those values are stated there, you know, as what was happening in Portugal. Actually, he was very adamant about not saying it was a coup d'etat. We did not want a coup d'etat. We wanted an actual revolution. He explained, because a coup d'etat just sometimes changes who's in power and nothing changes for society. That's not what we wanted. He mentioned this on the event that we had on the 20th with students many times. We wanted a full revolution that would change not just the people in power, that would change the country and the opportunities for the country. You know, did everything work you know, well? Not really. But is Portugal a much better country 47 years later? Obviously, I think we would all agree, independently of how we feel about it, it is a much different country. You know, we had the highest literacy rates in Europe. We had lots of diseases that weren't cured. My grandfather had heart disease, and he was told to go to the store, the Vinda, and buy some olive oil that would help him with his heart disease. And so, I mean, you know, it was unheard of to have the modern medicine that the Portuguese now have today, just like most people all over the world. So as we turn to our last go around, and a couple of different things. And first and foremost, as Luis said, we did have a lot of fun with the students, and would always do a march, uma manifestação at Berkeley, and that's always a lot at Berkeley. You know, every day they protest about something, and so we would protest with our carnations, with our cravos. Oh, mine's already, look at the já está a murchar o cravo. And so we would do that, and it was wonderful, because students would ask us, you know, UC Berkeley, what are you guys doing? What are you protesting again? Because they're ready to join any kind of protest. So, you know, what are you protesting? And then we would tell them, oh yeah. And it's interesting that at Berkeley, at Cal, they would actually, a lot of the students, as Luis would remember, knew about the revolution. You know, they actually, not Portuguese of any ethnicity, they knew about the revolution in Portugal, if they were especially the political science students. So I wanted to go back around and ask everyone your thoughts on, you know, how do we move forward with it? In other words, in the communities, I do believe, because of the values, and I think all of you touched it in one way or another, that it is an important holiday in Portugal, an important event in Portugal, an important event in Portuguese history that should be reminded, you know, and should be lived in our community, just like we celebrate Santo Antonio and São Pedro and everything else, and just like we celebrate the 10 de Junho, which, as all of you know quite well, was utilized by the old regime as a political move. I mean, it was called O Dia da Raça, and we're not a race, you know, but it was the idea to put forth that we were above everybody else. And so the 10th of June had been very politicized by Oliveira Salazar and his kangaroos. And so the 25 de Abril had its moments. It had, of course, that communist influence. And of course, some of you, I know all of you follow the news in Portugal, and you have seen that they're commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Portuguese Communist Party. It's been in existence in Portugal for 100 years. The revolution has only been 47 years. Where were they the other 53 years? They were working underground. And so when the revolution happened, they were ready to go, because they'd been working for over half a century underground, where all the other parties were most of them were formed after the revolution. They didn't even know, as Eduardo said, if they were socialists or if they were this or if they were that. They just, you know, they formed all these parties, And the Portuguese Communist Party, one of the reasons it had a lot of pull, it had some influence, obviously, was that it had been working underground for 53 years before the revolution. So it had been organized. But regardless of what we think, how do we, what do you think that can be moving forward? What would you like to see the community do, the community organizations, schools, universities, what we do at Fresno State? What can we all do in a little bit of way to celebrate this a little bit more, and to talk about and to pass on these values that are important to a democracy? Because I always tell my students when they tell me about their grandparents that José Luis and Esmeralda also mentioned, a couple of you, that came over, and Inês mentioned also came over during the dictatorship, and so they didn't have that experience of democracy. And so when we talk about that, and it's important that we acknowledge that, but the reason we have opportunities is because of the democratic system we have here. All of us have had these opportunities in this democratic state. So I've never found it counterproductive to celebrate democracy in the land of democracy. When people say, why are we celebrating 25 de Abril in America? Why not? This is where it began, the modern day democracy, And so how do we move forward? That was one of the questions that I wanted to throw out to everybody. And not from a political standpoint, obviously, but what can we do in the Portuguese American community to actually bring this important date to light, and how can we move forward with it? And just permit me just to let you the bit about the schools. And I think that schools and education, and whether it be high schools or elementary schools that have Portuguese programs, or universities, of course, they can always do, and they're traditionally the ones that have been doing something. And just a little anecdotal situation. In 1999 was the 25th anniversary of the 25 de Abril, and José Luis remembers that we had a big event here. We had a symposium at the time that we did, Filaments of the Atlantic Heritage, that some of you participated in the second, and the one we just did a couple of weeks ago. And we celebrated the 25 de Abril. Major Vitor Alves, which was one of the 25 de Abril captains, was here at the time, and it was quite a big event. And we took 325 Portuguese language students at the high schools here in our city. At the time, there were 2 of them, and we took them to the Portuguese hall, and we filled the hall with these almost 350 kids and a few of their parents. And a good friend of ours, José Francisco Costa, who is a songwriter, poet lives in Massachusetts, taught at Bristol Community College, and José Francisco and a couple of people and the major were in charge of this program for the students. And I think some of you will appreciate this. And so one of the parts was to teach them the symbols of Abril. And of course that famous line, "O povo unido jamais será vencido." So they had all of them stand up and, shout this, and put their hands up and do this. "O povo unido jamais será vencido." When we're doing this, and my superintendent walks in, or my principal, I said, my principal walks in, because I always invite him to these things. And my principal walks in, and he sees me, and and I'm doing this along with the kids. I'm teaching the kids, how to do this, and he turns to me and he says, "I don't want to know what's going on. I'm sure it's all okay. This is, I'm sure, a huge success. We'll talk about it someday." And he walks out. Because there are some symbols of the 25 de Abril that, it might shock someone in America doing that, with the and seem a little bit too politicized to one area or another. So, but it was important for the kids. The kids still today talk to me about those symbols, about this was, the kids, they're now in their late 30s, but they still talk about learning those symbols of Abril. So I'll start with this time with Esmeralda. Esmeralda, from your perspective as an artist and as someone who writes, what can the creative community do as well to contribute to the awareness of 25 de Abril in North America?
Yikes.
I know, not that you have, of course, the magic answer, but, what are some of your thoughts? Because I think the creative community can certainly help.
Well, actually, I wanted to start by thanking you for adopting Elaine and me, because out here, our community is pretty small in Vancouver, and actually, I'm pretty removed from it. So I'm not aware that we do anything for the 25th of April. And of course, as a writer, I think of, what do I think of? Readings, and events. I know I try to do it with my family. We buy carnations, we watch the movie, we listen to songs, we talk about it. The book that I was talking about, but this was the photography exhibit in Lisbon in 2014. So we got the book, and so we get this out once a year, and we go through it and talk about it. But I think as a community, I mean, what can I think of is readings and education. I think is so important. So I mean, my kids are really interested in history, and I think my husband too, who's Canadian, and I think they probably know more about it than I do because they're history buffs. But I think the answer lies in education and holding events that will educate both people who, like me, came before the revolution and people who came afterwards and people who know nothing about Portugal. Because it really is something that there was this revolution that was, there wasn't a whole lot of loss of life, and it changed things so completely. So yeah, I don't have any answers, but I
but
think
that's a wonderful, the families is wonderful. I mean, if it starts, if we can just get one or two more families to actually do it at home and to talk about those values and to get the carnations, and it's the same thing as we do for other holidays that have to do, some of our holidays mixing with religion or not. So why not do that for the 25 de Abril? That's a wonderful, that's a great suggestion. Families, yeah, indeed. Thank you. And Sergio, what can we do, and what can Palcus do? Put Palcus on the spot.
Oh boy. I've got the banner behind me, so I've got to.
Yeah, you reminded me of the banner. So with the banner. So tell me, what can Palcus do?
I think we need to create more of a dialogue. I think as you know, Denise, you're at the forefront of this. Portuguese language instruction, Star Talk, is very much a major initiative for us this year. We're coming off this past week an important reception with the Portuguese American Caucus. We're trying to refund Star Talk. I think this should be part of the curriculum for starters. I think I'm sure it's touched on, but I think it needs to be reinvigorated. And I would echo some of the comments that José Luis and Miguel offered at the outset, that what's more American than the values of democracy, freedom, and opportunity? There's nothing more American than that. So for a generation, I'll speak for myself as a generation that was born here. For us, that resonates with us, and it takes a little bit of the politicization, as you mentioned, out of it. So if we can celebrate that, in the curriculums, in the schools, we could use another festa. I don't know, maybe an April festa, something that maybe catches some steam. But as far as Palcus goes, I think reinforcing that maybe. And I know that there's plans for us to do that in the curriculums in the schools. I think would have the most profound effect, because the kids don't know.
Indeed, and it's to be celebrated by all ethnicities. Because it's such a romantic revolution. I mean, cravos, when I tell students, the story, of the carnations on the guns. I mean, that's just romantic. That's a good storytelling. I mean, I'm sure Esmeralda and Elaine can write about this all day long, because it's wonderful. It's just, it's pleasing. And so, indeed, we'll just skip around. Zedward, what can we do? What can San Diego do and in California? What are your thoughts?
I don't think it's an easy approach, unfortunately, in my point of view. It's not an easy approach starting in Portugal itself. If you look at the historian books from Portugal, they have less and less lines talking about 25 de Abril lately. So when I usually bring a bunch of books from Portugal, especially when I'll go, and I went to a couple of those community events. And that's one of the things that I had asked one time about 25 de Abril, and also what the future entitles for, because over there it's just a holiday. Actually, it's almost becoming a holiday. And hey, I have the day off. That's one of the things they're worried about. But if you look at the books, the historical books from Portugal, they are talking less and less about 25 de Abril. So they are talking less. Think about the books for the immigrants right now. They almost say nothing about 25 de Abril. Yes, you mentioned we do the Dia de Portugal, Dia das Comunidades, the Camões, but it involves three different things. And well, yes, we're proud to be Portuguese. It's communities, Camões, o grande escritor. But o 25 de Abril, as celebrações do 25 de Abril, just for to be emphasized here in the communities, and we'll say here, see all the communities around the world outside of Portugal. It's not going to be easy. And I'll say this because I have kids, and what is the democracy to my kids? They were born and raised in democracy. And it was not a little bit like me because I had a little bit of both, even knowing that I was still young and I didn't know much about politics. Well, we didn't talk about politics. Everything was controlled. There was that's not an easy subject to really change or to make it become a good memory and to make a party and a special event. We've done a few times in Sunday. And tell you the truth, there is not much of community members that are there that come and participate. Because again, didn't mean much to them because they came before. It doesn't mean much to the new generation because they were born and raised in democracy. And so I go back to what José Luis da Silva was saying. You have to teach these kids. You have to explain to them what happened before, what was the reason, and what happened after. That was so important, but they don't know. We have to have. I would say yes, we can say it on the schools when you teach Portuguese, like my son in high school is doing. Yes, we have to tell those young generation really the history about this, and what was the reason it was so important for Portugal, because we never went. Our kids have no idea about the before and after all that situation. So it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy for us to do a big event and feel like we feel other events. Doesn't have tradition, religious tradition. We are so used to have something. It's Nossa Senhora de Fátima, it's Spirit Santo. We have to have something that we feel, and we have the religion that we do have. Oh my gosh, I couldn't name all the saints that I perform to all over because there's so many. So we do find, I always, when I play the jokes with Zeda Adega, some of you know that I have a ventriloquist puppy that jokes all about this. And he always says, the Portuguese are all the same. We need to have an excuse of a saint to eat and drink. So we have to have something. We have to have something behind us. And unfortunately, 25 de Abril does not mean a lot for our new generation and didn't mean a lot for the ones that came before. So it's not an easy subject. Yes, we have to train the people. Yes, we have to teach them about what happened before and after and make them see. Because yes, it was an important step in our past history of Portuguese. But to do that, to approach that, it's not going to be easy. Yes, it might take a lot of not just teachers, but community leaders. But I don't see it happening that strong like any other event. Give me a saint and I'll do a party. But 25 de Abril, unfortunately, unfortunately, that's just my.
We'll have to find out who the patron saint of the 25th of April is.
We can do that. Too.
We can do that.
I think you can create one really quick. So
yeah, other communities have done that in the past. That's for sure. Yeah. And so. Good points. I mean, it's going to be hard. I do think that you can celebrate it in different times. I mean, that's actually what my op-ed piece for this week for newspapers I write, which is, let's celebrate let's celebrate 25 de Abril at other times. When you have these so-called, these parades, put something about the 25 de Abril, even if the parade is in September. But maybe that's one way to have a constant reminder. Whether you're celebrating Cabrillo Day or you're celebrating, some other event, or you're having, a Romaria in one of the Portuguese clubs. Why not have something about the 25 de Abril? Because it is going to take a whole village. Annabella, your thoughts, other than Sergio's ideas for palcos?
I think that just like a lot of you have touched on, a very large component of the oppression was via education, or the lack of, or the prevention and the limiting of education. That's why only certain people were or had access to education and to go to university and knowledge, because knowledge really keeps or gains or is the road to freedom. And that's what, you know, Salazar and his cronies didn't want. So if you kept everything limited and prevented you from becoming educated, then you were just going to follow the rules. But I think that, and I mean education, not so much like in the schools, but in the communities and even via Palcus. You know, there's different forms of educating people, because there's, you know, everybody's talked about the 25 de Abril and our thoughts and what we remember of it. But like you have also said, there were some bad parts. There were some bad consequences. There were some bad things that we remember. And I, you know, again, I was very young, but 12 years old, I can remember the refugees. There were more people living outside of Portugal than they were inside of the country. When we had to take back so many people that were stripped of what they had in their, where they thought was their country, where they lived, were stripped of their home and their belongings and had to leave everything behind and, you know, come into this little country, and were given access to things that the Portuguese that lived in mainland Portugal couldn't have. Like they had priority to education. They got priority to do certain things that other people were deprived of. You know, the fact that a lot of people came with the clothes on their backs. I mean, that's part of history and nobody talks about it. We talk about 25 de Abril and, you know, the Carnations and how peaceful it was and how it was a revolution that really changed the country. And, you know, we stopped living under a dictatorship, but there's so much more. And that's why education is so important. And I think that a lot of people, whether they are living in this country and came here before 25 de Abril, or even those that were that came after, have either forgotten about it or don't realize the extent to which the refugees affected us and how they were affected, because they were Portuguese after all. And, you know, we talk about, you know, refugees from other countries, and we have a lot to learn, and we have, you know, and that's why I think education is so important on this issue. And we can start in the schools. We have the community schools, we have Palcus, we have these forums that, you know, we can elaborate on and provide, get some older people in here that have lived some stuff, that have lived and have some memories of those times, and make it like real. You know, when somebody tells their story, you kind of like feel it, and you remember, oh, you know, I heard that man say this and that. It's different than if you just read it in a book. And like José Luis said, I'm sorry, Eduardo said, you know, the books are saying less and less about 25 de Abril. And so, you know, we can't rely on the books anymore. So we need to do it in another way.
So indeed, just so use all of the different resources and tell the entire story, basically.
Yep, absolutely.
David, as a fadista, what can the arts actually do? You know, and we talked with that a little bit
through music. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, speaking personally, you know, there's a couple of fados that, you know, I sing that had controversy before 25 de Abril. And, you know, more than just awareness and education, I don't think there's much more that we can do to quote unquote celebrate 25 de Abril in this country, other than bringing that awareness through, you know, education, through singing. For example, I've got a couple of fads that I do reference. Oh, this fad was written, one of them was called O Fado da Freira. It was written before 25 de Abril, but it had been censored and it wasn't allowed to be sung in Portugal. And so instead they sent it to Brazil. And it was recorded in Portugal even after 25 de Abril, but the one verse that excluded this fado from being, or that censored this fado from being sung, was excluded from the recording even after 25 de Abril. luckily I found it, so I sing it now because, you know, Salazar is dead. So, and it's stories like that that we can bring education to people and awareness about 25 de Abril. As far as celebration and people acknowledging it, you know, I think the immigrants, and I speak on behalf of my family, their 25 de Abril happened the day they got to this country. Because they came into democracy in this country. So their 25 de Abril is a different meaning for them, I feel. And so I think celebrating it for some of them just brings back those old bad memories and those fears. And they associate 25 de Abril, even though it's a good thing because, you know, we broke away from dictatorship, it still brings up those memories of pre-25 de Abril. And like Zé Duarte said, you know, most of our cultural activities and most of our community activities is all faith driven. Politics does not have a place with faith. And so I don't think you'll see a lot of support within the community that's here now that has been here pre-25 de Abril, adapting to a celebration like that. For myself,
one question though, one question,
Mm-hmm.
but do you see the younger people? So, you know,
I don't.
I mean, the older people, my generation and older, you know, I mean, they're going to be what they're going to be. I have friends of mine who tell me all the time, you know, não te preocupes com os velhos da tua idade. And so, because they're going to be what they're going to be. It's not like you're going to change somebody who's 75 years old, but you know, we're all concerned about your generation and younger generation than yourself.
I definitely do not see our generation celebrating it. I think teaching it and being aware of it, yes, definitely. But that's the same to say, oh, we should teach and celebrate the 4th of July in Pico. You know, they're not going to do that. Even me as an American, if I were to move to Portugal or to Canada, yeah, I'm an American, but I'm also living in a different country, celebrating the independence of a different country and the country that I chose to leave. I just don't see that happening, to be realistically honest with you. Yeah. Aside from being an educational purpose and bringing awareness to the youth as part of historical facts of what happened, I don't see it being played as a celebration or a festa.
Right, but it could be incorporated into a celebration or a festa, just like you incorporate it into your fado.
How would you do that? I can incorporate it with fado, but like if you're having a Spitzent festa, you're not going to have people dressed up in military uniforms with carnations.
But that's the issue. That's the issue. We need to take that. I think that's what Annabella was saying. We need to take the politics out of it. You know, and we'll ask everybody else as well. We need to take the politics and the military militarization out of it, and incorporate it into the simple fact that you know, and I'm sure there's got to be studies. You know, for example, the Espírito Santo in the Azores, or Santo Antonio or São Pedro in the Marchas Populares in Lisbon. I'm sure there were many marchers that were not allowed to go out, you know, and talk about anything. I mean, they had to be censored. So maybe we could use the idea that these events, even though they were very faith driven, and they still are, they were censored in one way or another. Because Carnaval was. I mean, you know, Carnaval is the Portuguese in the Azores. In Terceira Island, they have these skits. For those of you who are not from Terceira, we all assume that everybody knows about these things. But these skits from Terceira Island, my father was it's these skits that are like, you know, dancing kind of vaudeville routine. Some of you know about it, and so my father was a fan of Carnaval. Played in Carnaval, sang in Carnaval, and he would tell this to me in fondness of this dança that they did, this act that they did, that they had two versions. They had to remember two versions, okay, with two different kinds of, and they would go to a freguesia, an aldeia, and they would say, hey guys, is there anybody here from Pete? Nah, there's nobody here from Pete, whatever. So they would do the version to criticize the government. They would get to another village, they say, hey, no, there's people here. They would see the version that the government had authorized. So, I mean, that's creativity, and we can teach that to our kids nowadays, you know, or Carnaval can incorporate it now, you know. So I you know, that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying to do a festa, you know, 25 de Abril festa, but do you think that you've incorporated in your fado, so there's a possibility it could be incorporated into other aspects?
I agree.
Think? Okay. Good, good. I'm glad I got you over. I'm going to have you start celebrating 25 de Abril all the time. Let's go over. It was just to throw that in. I think you brought up some very good points, David, and I agree that it's very hard to do just a celebration. But how can we incorporate it in other aspects as well? Inês, your thoughts, because you did an event 2 years ago.
Yeah, my thought is that well, I know there's a movie out called Capitães de Abril. But my thought would be to put out a documentary with local, multi-generational people talking about their real life experiences, and just making it relatable so that their grandchildren or great-grandchildren would be able to relate to the stories. It would be educational, but at the same time relatable, and it could be, I'm not saying I'm going to produce this, but it's an idea to kind of remember the past. And, you know, they say in order to understand where you're going, you need to know where you came from. So I think that would be a good piece of legacy to leave our future generations. We will celebrate 25 de Abril again as soon as we're not having it this year, but maybe next year when we rededicate the new tiles and azulejos. They're not calçadas and azulejos at the park. So we will probably do it in April and commemorate the Liberdade and honor the park and our traditions that are there, and the people that took the time and energy and to bring the two cities together and all the history behind it. So we plan on doing that.
Indeed, that's a good point. The Sister City Foundation movements that lots of cities throughout the United States and Canada, especially the US and Canada as well, have sister cities all over, in Portugal, in the Azores, in mainland Portugal, Madeira. And why not? Some of them haven't done, some of the sister city that exists don't do much. We know that. Why not tie it to the 25 de Abril and do something around that as well? That's a good point.
Hayward had a proclamation about making that day like a Portuguese immigrant liberty kind of day. It's in their books.
Good. Get that to us so we can move it to other cities, and David will take it to the city's hall in San Jose. But that is a good point, and to learn about these, the sister city movements, indeed. We have a few more that we haven't heard from. Miguel.
So I would say if we want to get the 25 de Abril message of values and so forth, I think we need to organize events that are more popular in nature. I'll give a specific example. When Dia de Portugal, de Camões e das Comunidades, was a more formal set of events in California, very few people attended. They attended because they were part of who was American or the other fraternals, or the hosting club or whatever. So it was only when it became a more popular event, an outdoor event with music and food and so forth, did we have much bigger crowds. So that's something that, if there's the educational piece, obviously, but if we want to gather multi-generational folks and really get the message of values and so forth across, I think it has to be more popular in nature. The event has to be more popular. The other point I would make is we need to bridge with the former soldiers who were in the colonial wars. One event that happened about a year and a half ago in Turlock at Our Lady of Assumption was the unveiling of a statue commemorating the people who fought in those wars. There's a lot of resentment still to this day from the folks many thousands who gave their lives in the colonial war, and many of those, especially men, see that, well, the country gave everything away. I fought so hard, the country gave everything away. So I think from an educational perspective, again, taking politics aside, taking the military aside, one of the things is bridging that. I think the ceremony was very beautiful and very poignant because it was a thank you. Whether you agreed with the regime or you didn't agree with the regime, you were serving your country. So thank you. So I think that's a big piece in trying to bridge a lot of the folks that in a community where like I could care less about Vincent. So bringing those values and trying to bridge those generations in more popular events. We have 3 years to prepare this. It's going to be a special event in 3 years. And I hope we can all work together to make it happen.
It's a good point. Although we do have to be careful not to whitewash the, as you mentioned, thank the soldiers because it's not like they volunteered. It's not a volunteer army like we had here. They were drafted whether they liked it or not, But by the same token, because we have both sides of the fence on that. I mean, I have some people who I've met who, have the idea that, Angola and also and all that stuff. And then you have the folks who said, hey, I went there, I saw firsthand, how things happened, And so we cannot wash that, colonialism was not good for Portugal. It was not good for the world. And I think that one of the reasons we had so many deaths, unfortunately, is exactly what the Admiral said, that I mentioned at the outset, which is, it lasted too long. It just went on forever and ever and ever. And so that is, but indeed, you need to bring that, we need to bring everybody into it and hear all voices. Okay. And I don't know if we are even, as I think, David hit on the nail on the head when he said, how much can we, have a festa about it? I don't even know if we can have an event as the Dia de Portugal. I wouldn't be advocating that, but I do think that, we can do things in the community that celebrate it at a different level than the Dia de Portugal or the Festa do Espírito Santo or Nossa Senhora da Assunção or the Fátima or any of that as well. So, Elaine, your thoughts, and of course, as an educator and also as an artist.
Thank you. Well, I think there are great suggestions here. I think we should celebrate. I've actually been celebrating it for like 4 years in a row at literary events. People read my play in New York on Cinco de Abril, and then everyone sang. There are recent immigrants from Portugal. But I think it's very important to tell stories and focus on literature and theater in particular, because I actually think there's great silence. That's how I see it, is that there's been great silence about what happened both in Portugal. People didn't want to talk about it afterwards. I have cousins there that lived through those times. And like people are saying on this forum, if you were 3 people, one of those people could be peed. So that created great fear about talking about it in Portugal. And only recently they founded the Museum of Resistance and Freedom. I don't know if you know it. And it's an amazing museum. It's right next to the Cathedral de Sé. And it's a very powerful experience because so many, there was so much resistance people didn't know about. They showed where people got deported to. They showed the boxes people were held in and trying to write poems. It's a very emotional experience. So I think Portugal's only beginning to heal from the dictatorship even now, because we were silenced. So many of us had to immigrate because of the lack of opportunities. So even in our communities, there's great divides. In Vancouver, one of the most famous Portuguese coffee bars has a big picture of Salazar. And every
They've taken it down, I think.
Oh, they have? Okay. Well, that they used to always, maybe like last year. Right.
Yeah.
But also even in San Diego, if you won Miss Portugal, you got to go meet Salazar, right? So there's a lot in our history that is still divided. When people came to my play, people were crying and talking about things on both sides. People that survived being locked up, but also I had a woman whose father was a member of the secret police. So a lot of it is still buried and needing to come out through discussion, through oral history, through documentary, through theater, through literary readings. So I think let's keep on celebrating and talking like we are now, because to me, I see it more as silence, like a survival method was keeping the kids under the basket. Have you heard that phrase from the Azores? Like you kept it a secret, you kept the kids out of it, but it's now time for us to lift up the basket. So that's my thought.
That's a very good point. A lot of this part is because we've been silent too long because of dividing what Miguel mentioned, and a couple of folks as well, Professor Zé Luís, we're gonna, we bring in academia last. So, Professor Zé Luís, what are your thoughts on this? And I can, before I turn to Luís, one further thing that like. And David said, and he's right, where, don't expect that, it's going to be as big if we did something as a Festa that has 100-year history, obviously. And it has, other values that are traditional to the people, or the Romaria, the Nossa Senhora de Fatima, and that has been celebrated for years in Newark, New Jersey. It's, you're not going to be able to compete, and there's no competition possible. But I do believe, and let me throw this out, and I'll probably get, chopped my head off a couple of times for this, but I'm used to it. And I do believe that the Portuguese diplomatic corps has responsibility here. I don't understand why there isn't a celebration at every single consul, at every single. It's not up to the organizations to do the event and invite the consuls or the ambassadors or the honorary consuls, and I'm one of them, so I'm guilty. I believe that the diplomatic corps has a responsibility to celebrate 25 de Abril, because as most of you were saying, and as David mentioned, it's not celebrated anywhere in the community. So why not begin with the diplomatic corps? Why is the diplomatic corps, my question, afraid of 25 de Abril? That's a question that I believe, and if anybody from the ambassador all the way up in both countries, Canada and the United States, and any consul general is listening, because I believe that it's such an important history day for modern day Portugal, and they are Portuguese officials, that and the community does not have that tradition. So it's not like something they're taking away from the Sport Club Português or the Irmandade do Espírito Santo. It's not something that's being done and they're going to all of a sudden take it and make it a state thing. No, I believe that if every single consulate in the United States and Canada, and both embassies, and every single honorary consul would celebrate, then I think we have we have it covered, because there's one or two or three in every different states. That's my thought. I've never understood why the 25 de Abril was never celebrated at an official level, because it's an official level, as you know. It's done in the assembly. It's done by the president. It's done by the diplomatic corps from other countries. In Portugal is all invited to attend, and so. Why not do it here? Why not invite the diplomatic corps from other countries? If you're an ambassador, why not invite all the other ambassadors to partake in this ceremony that brought Portugal into the world, into the league, in not an official name, but the League of Democratic Nations. José Luís.
Well, I hope my battery lasts. It keeps telling me I'm running out of battery here. Interesting enough that Elaine touched on something that I've been thinking for a while here while I was waiting, and that is theater. I think that's something we could do. I'm not talking about a full-fledged theater. David will remember that at Cesar High, we used theater a lot in the classroom and in the community through skits, little vignettes. And I'm just here imagining how we could address the values of and the realities of post and pre and post revolution through a combination of skits. For example, we could show the stories we just talked about. Your father listened to the radio. Me listened to the radio under the covers, afraid that somebody might know what stories. I was listening to all kinds of things and showing it with humor, because our community likes humor. I mean, you mentioned the Desert Carnival. I mean, from Terceira, but that's something that our community loves to be part of. And I think through theater we could do what. Okay, theater does two things, as we all know. It entertains and educates. And I think in our community we are not going to be able to educate without entertaining. So we could associate. We have two fingers in here. I can just see the pre. We could have somebody singing Tony de Matos, Só Nós Dois, and in the post we could have somebody singing Sobral, Amor Dois or Por Dois. I mean, we could put the symbols in this. I mean, I can just see out in a couple of in a series of vignettes done in a skit. We could do something that was funny, that would not be doctrinary. We don't want to be out there, telling people how great the revolution was and was not, but basically showing them what was talked about here, the values, and how the values of the revolution of 25th of April have a lot to do with our values here in America. I'm just repeating what you guys have been saying. And I think our community would embrace that. They would understand that if it's done with humor, if it's done with a certain amount of flair and images and music and all that. It doesn't have to be a very complicated thing. And we could take that to schools. We have right here in this group, right here, the people that could do this. I know in different parts of the country and all that, and even in different countries, but I we have the ideas. I think we kind of came to a consensus here to a certain extent of what is really important, how we could celebrate. Please, let's not celebrate indoctrinating and showing. People don't want that anymore. People want to arrive at their own conclusions through something that's given to them, rather than just what we say in Portuguese, a papinha to the feita. So people are smarter than that. We need to entertain them, but give them ideas and connect. Connections are very important. Connect, this experience with their experience, and then connect generations. Connect the grandparents with grandkids over here. I think that and putting together all the different arts, the visual, the music, and doing something without being heavy or academic. As much as I love plays that are deep, this would have to be something light and following our traditions in our community.
Yeah, indeed. I think you can have both worlds. You can have the Academy doing what they're doing, and they have been doing. The Academy is the only thing that's been doing the 25 de Abril, Dartmouth and a couple of the universities in Canada. And so the Academy has been doing it, but I think at a popular level, it has to be what, like the example that David said, that he sings this song and he explains this was prohibited. And, he sings it with that lyric, and just doing that one part, he's celebrating Abril at every single one of his shows. If he does it, I don't know if you do every single one of the shows, but at a lot of the shows. So I think it can be done. The Carnaval, the same thing, the Romaria. Anyway, I had asked you for about an hour and 15 minutes to an hour and 20 minutes. It's been an hour and 50. So thank you so much. We're going to end it here. As Jean-Louis says, there's lots of good ideas. I've taken notes. I saw that Elaine was, I think, taking notes as well. It's part of being a teacher. We take notes all the time. And so thank you all. This is also going to be recorded. It's recorded actually, and it's going to be part of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute's Oral History Project Archive that we're building at Fresno State. So even if it's not next year, even if it's just, even if it's 50 years from now, somebody will know that in 2021, April 25th, there was a discussion, multinational discussion about the 25 de Abril. And so I'm going to ask my friend Zé Duarte, and those of you who stick around for just about 3 minutes. Zé, can we sing? Can you lead us? And I'll ask those of you who have good voices, and especially David, obviously. But those of us like me, I'm going to be silent, because if I will tune you off completely. I cannot carry a tune, and so, or I'll sing, but like way back here. Let's try to sing Grândola. Do you want me to put the words up here? Does everybody know?
Grândola? No, I actually still remember from those days the words, but you can put for the other ones.
Can everybody see the words here?
Yes.
Okay. There you go. So even on those days, they didn't have music to start. It was just the marching of the military. If you remember that, that's still really vivid on my mind, especially from that day. And you'll be just having the marching, and people will be singing. And again, I got to remind you, who was singing Zeca Afonso, he had the pronunciation of Alentejo, which is the south of Portugal. So we have a little variation to the vowels, almost close to the fado, to the variation, Alentejano. It's a little bit different. So you do go like this, more or less. Grândola, Vila Morena, terra da fraternidade, o povo é quem mais ama, dentro de ti, ó cidade, dentro de ti, ó cidade, o povo é quem mais ordena. em cada igualdade. Dentro de ti, ó cidade, jurei de ter companheira à sombra de uma azinheira. Dentro de ti, ó cidade, que já não sabia a idade. Just to give an idea.
Yeah, very nice. And I kept my mouth shut so I wouldn't tune you off. Okay. So, well, here's to 25 de Abril then, and to a new version that is going to be, as many of you suggested, celebrated in your families, in your in our local communities, in various ways throughout various times of the year. So, thank you all for joining me. Thank you all for being part of, on behalf of PBBI, the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at Fresno State. A million thanks to all of you who always collaborate. Thank you also thanks to Palcus for being a partner with us on this. And thanks to all of you, my friends, who are always willing to spend time to reflect, because I think we need to continue, whether it's 25 de Abril or there's a junho or Dia de Nossa Senhora de Fátima, we need to continue to reflect the Portuguese American presence, the Portuguese Canadian presence, I would say the Portuguese diaspora in North America. And kudos to Esmeralda and Elaine for being here with us. I believe that even with both coasts, but when it comes to things that involve California, we kind of need to be a little bit more inclusive and include the entire West Coast. We need to include people when we talk about the West Coast only. We need to include people in other states. Sometimes we just think California, California, California. We don't think about Arizona and Idaho and certainly British Columbia. So, and of course, when we do national things, including all of the different parts. Thank you all very much. And viva o 25 de Abril. Viva a liberdade. Muito obrigado. Muito obrigado. Good night, everyone.
Obrigado.
Boa noite a todos. Muito obrigado. Muito obrigado.